They didn't even bother to hide it. They built an entire neighborhood on my land and sent me a welcome letter like I was the one who didn't belong. The smell of fresh asphalt hit me before I even stepped out of the truck, thick and chemical, clinging to the back of my throat like something that wasn't supposed to be there. I killed the engine and just sat there for a second, staring through the windshield at what used to be open pasture. Rolling Texas grass that stretched for miles, now carved into perfect little rectangles with identical rooftops lined up like soldiers. My name is Ethan Caldwell, and 3 weeks ago, I inherited 1,100 acres from my grandfather. He called it the last piece of honest ground left in the county. I grew up on that land, learned how to mend fences, how to read the wind before a storm, how to respect something that doesn't belong to you. So when the lawyer handed me the deed, thick paper still smelling like old ink and dust, I thought I knew exactly what I was getting. I thought I knew every inch of it. I was wrong. The gravel crunched under my boots as I stepped out, but it didn't sound right anymore. Too clean, too uniform. Not like the uneven, familiar crunch I remembered. Ahead of me stood a stone entrance I'd never seen before. Polished. Expensive. A sign bolted into it read Silver Ridge Estates, in polished metal that caught the sun just enough to feel intentional. Like it wanted to be noticed. Like it was proud of what it had taken. I walked closer, my fingers brushing against the cold surface of the sign, and for a second, I could still hear my grandfather's voice in my head, low and steady, telling me that land doesn't forget who owns it. Then a golf cart rolled up beside me, electric motor humming soft and controlled, like it belonged here more than I did. The man behind the wheel wore a pressed polo shirt and mirrored sunglasses, the kind that reflect you back at yourself like a question you didn't ask. Residents only past this point, he said, polite but firm, like he'd said it 100 times before and never been challenged once. I looked past him, down the road that used to be a dirt trail I'd driven since I was 12. Now it was paved, lined with trimmed hedges and matching mailboxes, each one sitting on land I could feel in my bones was mine, in neat rows, roofs catching the last light, each one sitting on a foundation that traced back to a deed with my family name on it. I pulled the folder from the passenger seat again, the paper inside still stiff, still official, still very real. 1,100 acres. No subdivision clauses. No development transfers. No signatures that said we had ever given this up. The only thing I did not have yet was an explanation. So I went looking for one. The county records office still smelled the same as it did when I was a kid, dust and paper, and something faintly metallic from old filing cabinets. The clerk barely looked up when I asked for the parcel history, just pointed me toward a terminal like this was routine. Maybe for him it was. For me, it felt like stepping into a story that had been written without me. I started with the obvious. Property taxes had been paid. Every year. Automatically processed through the estate while my grandfather was alive and after he passed. No delinquency. No auction. No legal transfer. That ruled out the simple answers. So I dug deeper. Zoning changes. Permits. Development approvals. That is where it started to get interesting. About 18 months ago, the land had been reclassified from agricultural to residential development. Approved fast. Too fast. Signed off through a chain of requests that all traced back to one entity. Silver Ridge Homeowners Association. They had filed as if they were already in control. As if ownership was just a formality they could fill in later. I leaned back in that old plastic chair, the screen casting a pale glow across the desk, and felt that quiet shift again, sharper this time. They had not just built on my land. They had built a system around it. Permits. Infrastructure. Legal language designed to look complete. Designed to make someone like me walk away before asking the right questions. But here's the thing my grandfather taught me. Land does not care about paperwork that pretends to be truth. It only recognizes what is actually written, actually signed, actually owned. And as I scrolled through document after document, one detail kept showing up, small enough that most people would miss it. Buried in access agreements and utility filings. Every road, every water line, every entry point into that development traced back to original easements that had never been transferred. They were still tied to the master parcel. My parcel. I stared at that line on the screen for a long moment, listening to the soft hum of the fluorescent lights overhead, and for the first time since I saw that sign, I understood exactly what I was looking at. They did not just build on my land. They built their entire community on top of something they did not control. And that meant sooner or later, everything they thought they owned would have to answer to me. I did not call a lawyer that night because lawyers think in straight lines, and this situation was anything but straight. Instead, I drove back out to the property just after sunrise, when the air still carried that cool edge and the neighborhood had not fully woken up yet. Sprinklers clicked on in perfect rhythm, water mist catching the early light like something carefully staged, and for a moment, it almost looked peaceful if you did not know what it was built on. I parked along the main road, engine idling low, and just watched. People stepped out of front doors with coffee mugs, kids waited for school buses, garage doors lifted with that smooth mechanical hum that comes from brand new systems. They were living normal lives, completely unaware that every driveway they backed out of sat on land that was never theirs to begin with. That was the moment I made a decision that would change everything. I was not going to storm in and shut it down. I was not going to argue at the gate or try to tear apart what they had built. I was going to let it stand exactly as it was. Because if there is one thing more powerful than ownership, it is control. And control does not need to be loud to be absolute. I stepped out of the truck and walked along the sidewalk, my boots quieter this time against the concrete, taking in details I had missed before. Utility boxes tucked neatly between houses. Water meters aligned in rows. Access roads branching off like veins, all feeding back into one main artery that cut through the center of the development. Every piece of infrastructure told the same story. They had built fast, they had built confidently, and they had built under the assumption that nobody would ever challenge them. I stopped near one of the junction points where a maintenance panel sat partially hidden behind decorative shrubs. The metal was still new, edges clean, lock untouched. I crouched down, running my fingers along the surface, feeling the faint vibration of systems running beneath it. Water, power routing, probably communications. All of it depended on pathways that had to cross the original parcel lines. Lines that had never been transferred. I straightened up slowly, the plan forming not as a burst of anger, but as something precise, something inevitable. They had not just overlooked ownership. They had overlooked dependency. And dependency is leverage. I spent the rest of that morning mapping it out, not on paper, but in my head the way my grandfather taught me to read land. Where water flowed. Where access narrowed. Where a single decision could ripple outward without anyone realizing where it started. By the time the sun was fully up and the neighborhood noise picked up into its daily rhythm, I was already thinking 3 steps ahead of them. They believed they owned a community. What they actually had was a collection of houses sitting on borrowed ground, connected by systems they did not control, governed by an association that had built its authority on an assumption. And assumptions have a way of collapsing the moment they meet something real. I walked back to my truck, the smell of fresh cut grass stronger now, almost sweet, and for the first time since I arrived, I allowed myself a small, quiet smile. Not because I was angry, not because I wanted revenge, but because I finally understood the shape of the problem. And more importantly, I understood the solution. I did not need to take anything from them. I just needed to start charging them for what was already mine. I did not rush the next step because rushing is how people make mistakes, and mistakes are exactly what had allowed this entire situation to happen in the first place. Instead, I went back to town and spent 2 full days doing something most people skip when they think they already understand the problem. I verified everything. The county clerk's office, the zoning board, the utility commission, every place that had stamped a piece of paper connected to that development. The air in those offices always felt the same, recycled and stale, humming quietly under fluorescent lights, but the information inside them told a much louder story. Silveridge Homeowners Association had filed everything with confidence. Permits for roads, approvals for water lines, authorizations for electrical routing, all neatly packaged and signed off. But every single one of those filings relied on one critical assumption written between the lines: that they had the right to build on the land. They never proved it. They just moved forward like nobody would question it. By the time I walked out of the last office, I was not guessing anymore. I knew exactly where the cracks were. That afternoon, I made my first real move, and it was so quiet nobody noticed. I filed a formal notice of ownership affirmation on the master parcel, attaching the original deed, the inheritance transfer, and every supporting document that tied the land back to my name. No accusations. No threats. Just facts, recorded and time-stamped in a system that does not forget. Then I took it one step further. I filed a review request on all active easements connected to the property. Roads, utilities, access points, every single one of them. Not to cancel them. Not yet. Just to bring them under scrutiny. The clerk processing the paperwork glanced at me once, like she was trying to figure out why someone would bother with something so detailed, but she stamped it anyway. That sound, a simple mechanical press of ink on paper, carried more weight than anything I could have said out loud. By evening, I was back at the edge of the development, parked where the pavement met what used to be open dirt. The sun was dropping again, casting long shadows across houses that had been built too quickly to ever question their foundation. I stepped out and walked toward the entrance, the same stone sign catching the light like it had the day before. This time, I did not stop. I walked straight past it. No one blocked me. No one questioned me. Because I did not look like a threat. I looked like someone who belonged there, and in a way they did not understand yet, I did. Halfway down the main road, I saw her for the first time. Victoria Hargrove. She stood near the clubhouse, phone in hand, posture straight. Every detail about her controlled and intentional. The kind of person who did not just run a homeowners association, but believed she defined it. She was speaking to someone, gesturing lightly toward the street as if she was explaining how everything worked, how everything fit into place. Her world, her system, her control. I slowed my pace just enough to take it in, the way she moved, the way people around her listened without interrupting. Confidence built on structure. Authority built on perception. It was almost impressive if you ignored the fact that it was standing on something she did not own. She turned slightly, her eyes passing over me for a fraction of a second before moving on, dismissing me as just another resident or contractor or someone who did not matter. That was fine. That was exactly what I wanted. Because the strongest position you can have is the one nobody sees coming. I kept walking, letting the sounds of the neighborhood settle around me. Distant conversation, the low hum of air conditioning units, the faint rhythm of sprinklers cycling through another perfect evening. Everything looked stable. Everything looked permanent. And that is when I knew the timing was right. They had finished building. They had filled the houses. They had settled into routine, which meant they had everything to lose. I reached the end of the street, turned back once more to look at the rows of homes stretching across my land, and felt that same quiet certainty lock into place again. I was not here to argue with them. I was not here to take anything away overnight. I was here to let the system they built reveal its own weakness. And very soon, they were going to understand exactly what it cost to live on land that was never theirs. The next morning, I made it official, not with a confrontation, not with a phone call, but with paperwork so precise it felt almost surgical. I sat at my kitchen table, the same old wood surface my grandfather used to review cattle records, and spread everything out in front of me. Deed copies, parcel maps, easement filings. Every line connected, every boundary confirmed. The smell of black coffee lingered in the air as I signed the first document, slow and deliberate, letting the pen press into the paper just enough to feel permanent. Then I moved to the next step. I created a land use structure. Not a threat, not a claim, but a framework. If they wanted to exist on that land, there had to be terms. Legal, enforceable, unavoidable terms. By noon, I had filed the registration for a private land management entity tied directly to the master parcel. Simple on the surface, but underneath, it linked every access point, every utility corridor, every square foot of shared infrastructure back to one thing: me. The process was quiet, almost invisible, but it changed everything. That afternoon, I returned to the development again, this time not as someone observing, but as someone measuring impact. The sun was high, heat rising off the pavement in soft waves, and the neighborhood was alive in that comfortable, unaware way people have when they think everything is settled. A delivery truck rolled past me, tires humming against the road. I watched it carefully. It entered through the main gate, followed the central artery, and disappeared into one of the side streets. There was no alternative route, no secondary access. Everything flowed through a handful of entry points that traced directly back to the original land grid. My land grid. I kept walking, counting distances, noting intersections, observing how the entire place depended on smooth, uninterrupted access to function. It was not just houses. It was movement. It was flow. and all of it was sitting on top of a system that had never been transferred out of my control. Near the clubhouse, I slowed again, catching a glimpse of Victoria across the open lawn. She was speaking with a small group of residents, her posture relaxed, her tone confident, the kind of authority that comes from believing you are untouchable. I watched the way people nodded as she spoke, the way they trusted her to manage everything behind the scenes. Finances, rules, structure. She had built a world where she was the center of control. The only problem was, she had built it on something she did not understand. I turned away before she could notice me this time, not because I was avoiding her, but because there was nothing to gain from that conversation yet. Timing mattered more than presence. By early evening, I was back in my truck, windows down, letting the warm air carry the sounds of the neighborhood toward me. Lawn mowers in the distance. Kids laughing somewhere behind a fence line. The low, constant hum of air conditioning units working against the heat. It all sounded stable, predictable, dependent. I pulled out my phone and reviewed the final document I had prepared. A formal notice of land use adjustment. Carefully worded, legally grounded. It did not accuse. It did not threaten. It simply stated a fact. The land beneath the development was privately owned, and continued use of that land required compliance with updated terms. Access fees, infrastructure maintenance fees, land occupancy considerations. Every line backed by documents that had already been filed and recorded. I did not send it yet. Not immediately. Instead, I sat there for a few more minutes, watching the sun drop lower behind rooftops that should never have been there, and let the moment settle. Because once this moved forward, there was no going back to the illusion they were living in. They had built their entire lives on top of something they never truly owned. And I was about to remind them of that in the only language that mattered. Paperwork, timing, and a system they could not ignore. I waited until the timing felt inevitable, not rushed, not emotional, but precise, like setting a watch you know will go off exactly when it needs to. That night, just past midnight, when the neighborhood had gone quiet, and the only sounds left were distant air conditioning units and the occasional passing car, I sat at my desk and opened my laptop. The screen cast a soft glow. Across the room, reflecting off the same old picture frame of my grandfather standing out on that land decades ago, nothing behind him but open sky and grass that stretched for miles. I looked at that photo for a second longer than I planned to, then turned back to the document waiting on my screen. Everything was ready. Every filing recorded. Every clause verified. Every connection traced back to me in a way that could not be argued, only acknowledged. I took a slow breath, rested my hand on the mouse, and clicked send. It did not go to one person. It went to everyone. Homeowners, the HOA board, property managers, legal representatives tied to the development. A full distribution list built from public records and internal filings. Every email address pulled from a system they thought they controlled. The subject line was simple. Land use compliance notice. No drama. No emotion. Just something official enough that it could not be ignored. I leaned back in my chair and let the silence settle again, knowing that somewhere, in a few hours, phones would start lighting up with something they did not expect. Morning came fast. I was already back at the edge of the development before most people had finished their first cup of coffee. The sun was barely above the horizon, casting long shadows across driveways that suddenly did not feel as permanent as they had the day before. At first, nothing seemed different. A few cars pulling out. A jogger passing by with headphones in. Sprinklers ticking through another cycle like nothing had changed. Then I saw the first sign. A man standing at the end of his driveway, phone in hand, staring at the screen a little too long. His brow tightened, his posture shifting in that subtle way people do when something does not make sense. A few houses down, another person stepped outside, holding a printed sheet of paper, scanning it, then looking up toward the street like they were trying to connect pieces that did not fit. It spread quickly after that. Not chaos, not panic, just confusion moving quietly from one house to the next. People checking emails, rereading lines, calling neighbors. The kind of ripple that starts small but does not stop once it begins. I stayed where I was, leaning lightly against my truck, watching it unfold without stepping in. Because this was not about confrontation. This was about realization. By mid-morning, the clubhouse parking lot was filling up faster than I had seen the day before. Cars pulling in one after another, doors closing a little harder than usual, conversations starting before people even reached the entrance. I could not hear the words, but I did not need to. The body language said everything. Confusion turning into concern. Concern sharpening into urgency. And somewhere inside that building, I knew Victoria was already trying to hold it together, trying to explain something she did not fully understand yet. I pushed off the truck and started walking toward the entrance again, slow, steady, the same path I had taken before. This time, nobody stopped me. Nobody questioned me, because the system they relied on had already begun to shift under their feet. I reached the edge of the lot and paused, taking in the scene for a moment. The low hum of voices, the tension in the air, the quiet realization spreading through a community that thought it was stable. Then I looked up at the buildings, the streets, the entire development stretching out behind them, and felt that same calm certainty settle in once more. They were not losing anything overnight. Nothing had been taken. Nothing had been shut down. But for the first time since they built this place, they were being asked to acknowledge something they could not ignore. The ground beneath them was not theirs. And now, they were going to have to answer for it. By the time I stepped closer to the clubhouse, the tone had shifted from quiet confusion to something sharper, something more focused. Conversations were no longer casual. Voices carried just a little further, just a little tighter, like people were trying to make sense of something that refused to fit into their version of reality. The glass doors opened and closed in steady rhythm as more residents filed inside, each one holding a phone or a printed copy of the same notice, each one scanning lines that did not change no matter how many times. They read them. I stayed just outside the entrance, not hiding, not announcing myself, just present, because this part did not require me to speak first. It required them to ask the right questions. A few minutes passed before the doors opened again, and she stepped out. Victoria Hargrove. Her posture was still controlled, still composed, but there was something different now. Not fear. Not yet. But pressure. The kind that builds when control starts slipping in ways you cannot immediately fix. Her eyes moved across the parking lot, scanning faces, scanning reactions, and then they landed on me. This time, she did not look away. She walked straight toward me, heels clicking softly against the pavement, each step measured, deliberate. Up close, her expression held that same practiced calm, but there was tension just beneath it, like a surface stretched too tight. "You," she said, not loud, not confrontational, just certain. I met her gaze without moving, letting the silence sit for a second longer than most people would. "Ethan Caldwell," I said evenly, my voice steady, grounded in something she had not accounted for. Her eyes narrowed slightly, recognition not fully formed yet, but getting closer. "You sent that notice," she replied, holding up the printed document between her fingers, the paper catching the light. It was not a question. It was an attempt to anchor the situation to something she could control. I nodded once. "I did." She exhaled slowly, the kind of breath people take when they are recalibrating in real time. "This is a mistake," she said, her tone still composed but edged now with something firmer. "Silveridge Estates is a legally established community. Every permit, every approval, every structure here has been reviewed and authorized. You cannot just," she paused, searching for the exact word, "rewrite that overnight." I let her finish. Let her stand on everything she believed was solid. Then I answered just as calmly. "I did not rewrite anything," I said. "I acknowledged what was already in place." Her grip tightened slightly on the paper, a small detail most people would miss. "The land," I continued, "the access routes, the infrastructure. Pathways, they were never transferred out of the master parcel. They were built on top of it. There is a difference." For the first time, she did not respond immediately. Her eyes flicked down to the document, scanning a section she had likely already read 3 times, then back up to me. Around us, the low hum of voices continued, residents moving in and out, each one adding to the pressure building in the background. "We have legal counsel," she said finally, her voice regaining some of its edge. "If there is any issue, it will be handled appropriately." I gave a slight nod, not dismissive, not aggressive, just certain. "I would expect nothing less," I replied. "Everything I filed is public record. You can verify every line." She studied me for another moment, longer this time, as if trying to place something she could not quite define. Not just who I was, but what position I actually held in this situation. Because the dynamic she was used to, The one where she set the rules and everyone else followed them did not apply here. And she was starting to realize it. The air between us felt different now, not tense in a loud way, but heavy with something unspoken. A shift in control that did not need to be declared to be understood. She straightened slightly, adjusting her posture back into that familiar composure, but it did not sit the same way it had before. "We will be in touch," she said, turning the phrase into something official, something procedural, something she could still manage. I inclined my head once, watching her step back toward the clubhouse, the paper still in her hand, the weight of it clearly more than just ink and words now. As the doors closed behind her, I looked out over the parking lot, the rows of cars, the houses stretching beyond them, and listened to the quiet shift continuing to ripple outward. Nothing had been taken, nothing had been forced, but the foundation they stood on was no longer invisible. And once people see that, they cannot unsee it. By late afternoon, the shift was no longer subtle. It had weight to it now, something you could feel in the way people moved, in the way conversations stopped when someone new walked into the room, in the way the air itself seemed tighter than it had the day before. I was back near the main road, leaning against the hood of my truck, watching the flow of cars slow as more residents returned early, pulled in, stepped out, and immediately checked their phones again like the message might somehow change if they looked at it one more time. It did not. It said the same thing every time. The land beneath them was privately owned. Continued use required compliance. Clear, direct, documented. Inside the clubhouse, the meeting had clearly escalated. The glass doors were closed now, but voices carried through in fragments, sharper than before, overlapping, questions stacking on top of each other without answers landing clean. A few residents stood outside, not wanting to go in, not wanting to get pulled into something they did not understand, but unable to leave either. That is the thing about uncertainty. It holds people in place. A man in his late 50s walked up beside me, arms crossed, staring out at the rows of houses like he was trying to measure something that no longer added up. "You are the one who sent that notice," he said after a moment, not looking at me, just stating it like a conclusion he had already reached. I nodded once. "I am." He let out a slow breath, shaking his head slightly. "We bought here because it was supposed to be stable. HOA handles everything. Structure, rules, no surprises." He paused, then glanced at me for the first time. "This feels like a pretty big surprise." I did not argue with that. "It is not new," I said evenly. "It was just not acknowledged before." He looked back at the neighborhood again, quieter now. "So what happens next?" There it was. The question that matters. Not who is right, not who is wrong. What happens next? I pushed off the truck slowly, meeting his gaze. "That depends on how the association chooses to respond," I said. "The terms are already outlined. They can review them, verify them, and decide how they want to proceed." He frowned slightly, not fully satisfied, but understanding enough to know there was no simple answer. "And if they do not?" I held his gaze for a second longer, letting the weight of that possibility settle without dressing it up. "Then the system they built starts running into limits it was not designed to handle." He did not ask anything else after that. He did not need to. Across the lot, the clubhouse doors finally opened again, and this time the energy that came out was different. Not just confusion, direction. Board members stepping out with papers in hand, speaking quickly to small groups, trying to organize, trying to contain something that was already spreading beyond their control. Victoria stepped out last, her posture still composed, but the edge was gone now, replaced by something more calculated, more careful. She was adapting. That was expected. People like her always do. But adaptation takes time, and time was the one thing she did not fully control anymore. Our eyes met again across the distance, and this time there was no dismissal in her expression, no assumption, just recognition. She knew exactly who I was now, and more importantly, what position I held. I did not move. I did not approach. I let her stand there with the weight of it, the same way I had let the entire situation unfold up to this point. Because this was never about forcing a reaction. It was about creating a reality they could not ignore. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the development, stretching lines across streets that traced back to a boundary they had overlooked. I looked out over the houses one more time, the identical rooftops, the carefully maintained lawns, the systems humming beneath it all, and felt that same steady certainty hold firm. Nothing had been broken. Nothing had been taken. But the illusion of control had cracked wide enough that everyone could see through it now. And once that happens, everything that follows is just a matter of time. The next 48 hours did not explode into chaos the way most people would expect, and that was the part that made it more powerful. There were no sirens, no dramatic shutdowns, no sudden collapse. Instead, there was pressure, steady and unavoidable, building through systems that had always been invisible until now. Emails started circulating among residents, long threads filled with questions that had no clean answers. Legal teams were contacted, documents reviewed, language dissected line by line, but every path they followed led back to the same point. The land had never been transferred. The easements had never been reassigned. The foundation they relied on was not theirs. By the third day, the tone inside the community had changed completely. Conversations were no longer about whether the notice was real. They were about what it meant, what it cost, what options remained. I watched it unfold from the same quiet distance I had kept from the beginning, parked along the edge of the development where pavement met the original soil, where the transition was still visible if you knew what to look for. The air carried the same mix of cut grass and warm concrete, but underneath it was something else now. Uncertainty. Not loud, not chaotic, just present. Victoria moved differently too. Still composed, still controlled, but more deliberate, more measured. She spent most of her time inside the clubhouse, meeting with attorneys, board members, anyone who could help her reframe the situation into something manageable. But there are some things you cannot reframe. Ownership is one of them. Late that afternoon, she walked out again, this time alone, and came straight toward me without hesitation. No audience, no performance, just clarity. She stopped a few feet away, the sunlight catching the edge of the same document she had been holding for 2 days, now creased, no longer pristine. "We reviewed everything," she said, her voice steady but stripped of its earlier certainty. "The filings, the parcel history, the easements. You are correct. There was no resistance in the words. No argument. Just acknowledgement." I gave a small nod, not as a victory, but as confirmation. She glanced back toward the neighborhood, the rows of homes stretching out behind her, then back to me. "You understand what this does?" she continued, quieter now. "To the residents. To the stability of this place." I followed her gaze for a moment, taking in the same view, the same carefully constructed order that had been built on an assumption. "I understand. Exactly what it does," I said. "It puts things back in alignment with reality." She held that for a second, then exhaled slowly, the weight of it settling in a way that could not be avoided anymore. "What are you asking for?" she said finally. There it was. Not resistance. Not denial. Terms. I reached into my truck and pulled out a printed copy of the document, handing it to her without urgency. "Nothing that was not already outlined," I said. "Land use fees. Infrastructure access. Maintenance contributions tied to the actual ownership structure. Transparent. Enforceable. Fair." She took the paper, scanning it again, slower this time, not looking for a way around it, but understanding what it required. "And if we agree?" she asked. "Then everything continues," I replied. "The community stays. The systems stay. Nothing changes except the part that was never correct to begin with." The silence that followed was not tense. It was final. She nodded once, small, controlled, but decisive. "We will move forward," she said. "No dramatics. No collapse. Just a decision." As she turned back toward the clubhouse, I looked out over the land one more time. The houses, the roads, the quiet rhythm of a place that would keep running, just under different terms now. The same ground, the same space, but no longer based on an assumption. I leaned back against my truck, the evening air settling in, and let the moment pass without needing to hold on to it. Because this was never about taking anything from them. It was about making something clear. The land had always been mine. They just finally had to recognize it. And in the end, that was all it ever took.